How you doing, Mayor?
I'm doing all right.
Okay.
Good to see all these people here in San Francisco.
I seem to want to have a word with you.
All right.
Okay, let's do it. So, everybody in this room knows what this city is facing. So do you. Empty offices, cratering commercial real estate, budget deficit that takes up a good part of many of your days, the fentanyl epidemic, and that's just a Thursday, right? So, I want to start with how you feel about the way this city's woes are being portrayed and politicized.
Well, I think like any major city, San Francisco has challenges. And in fact, the issues around opioids have done something to our city and to other major cities like something I've never seen before. I was born and raised in San Francisco, and I grew up in public housing during the crack epidemic. And poverty, violence, hopelessness, despair. I mean, I lived in it differently, and the frustration that I have now as mayor of the city is how, I mean, really, now everything is on video. Back then, this stuff that would happen wasn't seen by other people unless you were in it. And now it's being circulated, these moments in times where these incidents occur, which are pretty sometimes terrible incidents, are being circulated, and people are choosing to jump on a bandwagon and be critical of what's happening in San Francisco without, in some cases, living in San Francisco, walking the streets of San Francisco, and understanding what this city really is about. Yes, we have problems. Yes, there are certain parts of the city, including the Tenderloin and the South of Market, that continue to struggle and continue to be very frustrating to deal with. But ultimately, it is important for us, especially people who are part of the fabric of San Francisco, to be a part of the solution, not just point at our leaders and policymakers to say, we want you to do something. Well, what can we do? What can we do with technology? What can we do to advance ideas? It's easy to point the finger and criticize. It's hard to roll up your sleeves and to get down into the weeds of doing the work to transform San Francisco.
Okay, so we're going to talk about that in a second. You mentioned video, and I think it's interesting that, San Francisco's business is everybody's business now, right? You know that. And
everybody's in our business.
Everybody is in your business. So I want to just take let's just take a quick look at this ad, which just dropped this week.
We don't need to look at that ad and give him any attention.
Let's look. Let's have a look.
We're here in the once great city of San Francisco. We came in here and we saw people defecating on the street. We saw people using heroin. We saw people smoking crack cocaine. And you look around, the city is not vibrant anymore. It's really collapsed because of leftist policies.
Okay. So you get the idea. So we're going to see a lot of those, and we already have. San Francisco is a character. Everybody's got an opinion, right? So Indianapolis has the same population as San Francisco, but not everybody or maybe a few more people.
Well,
right?
shoot, Miami has issues too, but
okay. But let's not do what about. Let's talk about San Francisco. Let's talk about San Francisco. Some of that is true. What are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are and let me just talk about some of the more recent policies that we've been implementing in our city. San Francisco has always been known as a place that people come, a beacon of hope, innovative, transformative. Folks came here to make money during the gold rush, the dot-com boom, and now everything that's happening around artificial intelligence. But at the same time, because we're a major city, drugs has been a part of it, whether it was heroin, whether it was crack, and now, unfortunately, opioids, in particular fentanyl, in a whole nother way. And what we found with some of our recent arrests, because we have now, instead of just arresting the dealers, we're arresting people who are publicly intoxicated in particular areas. And that has amounted to about 62 arrests, and 28% of those people had outstanding warrants, and only 8% of those people were actually San Franciscans. And we're finding people are coming here for so many different reasons, including the ease of access of getting these drugs. And the reason why it's important to start to dig deep and understand the challenges is to focus on the solutions, not just the doom and gloom that everyone's talking about, but how do we get these people into treatment, whether they volunteer for treatment or we are able to force them into treatment? How do we hold people accountable for breaking the law in ways that are killing people? Because the fact is, we're seeing more overdose deaths from opioids than we did during the height of the pandemic. And so this needs to be approached not just from a localized level, but from a state and a federal level. Our governors provided us with some additional resources. Recently, the California Highway Patrol, that's been here for less than 2 months, have confiscated enough opioids, fentanyl in particular, to kill 2.1 million people. And that's just with the CHP, the California Highway Patrol, and the work that they have been doing to assist us. And in fact, the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, as well as the U.S. Attorney Office on the federal level, they all are now getting involved in this because San Francisco, we have a shortage of police officers. We have challenges with enforcing the law. We don't have the capacity completely locally to address the number of challenges that exist here. And I think that in the next couple of months, as we get these additional resources, increase our capacity, start to hold people accountable, we're going to see some real change.
I'm curious, how many people have had an uncomfortable or frightening experience on the streets of San Francisco? Okay. How many people have had a car broken into? Okay. All right. So I think this tracks pretty well with the, I'm guessing about 40%. Those are horrifying numbers.
They are.
And the buck stops with you, right?
Yeah.
You didn't cause it. San Francisco's not the only city. But people are looking to you to fix it. And so what do you need? You have a $780 million deficit in this city. Problems galore. You just talked about some of them. What do you need to fix it?
I think part of what we need to fix is the issues around accountability related to people who break the law. And in fact, we have a really great DA. I'm really excited about working with her because a couple of things. Number one, previous DA was sending drug dealers to community drug court when they should be going through a different process. Now we're sending drug users to community drug court as a way to get people into treatment. There was basically one person who was prosecuting drug cases in her office. There are now 4 people that are focused on this work necessary to deal with this particular issue. And in fact, many of those various ranks around car break-ins, a lot of arrests, what gets talked about is the problems and what happens. What doesn't get talked about are when we make the arrest, when the DA also presses charges, and when we sometimes go before some of these judges who are releasing people, in some cases, for the wrong reasons. So the buck may stop with me, but at the end of the day, there are a lot of different layers that prevent me as a mayor from doing this job like a CEO, to be able to make the kinds of decisions necessary to even hire and fire my own police chief, or hire and fire department heads who oversee the work that we need to do in San Francisco. And then secondly, making sure that we are electing the kinds of people who believe in fairness, who believe in balance, who believe in transparency. And in fact, the biggest challenge that we're facing right now, 2 people who went through a whole process around drug dealing, evidence. The courts went through a case, they had a trial, the whole 9, and because of an alleged trafficking issue, they were let out even though they broke the law. It shouldn't matter. And I think part of the problem is we've made it too convenient for people to come in places like San Francisco and do whatever they want to do and get away with it. And we have to get back to some basics. Okay. I believe in second chances. I believe in alternatives to policing, which we've invested in. I believe in trying to get people on the right path. But for someone to cycle over and over
Absolutely.
and over and over through our court system and continue to be released, that is a broken system that needs to be addressed.
And as mayor, what will you do?
Part of what I can do is to bring attention to it, to try and get other people to run for judge, to make sure that, I'm supporting the district attorney and their budget and the request they made. I was able to add 3 additional prosecutors to her budget in order to make sure she had the resources and capacity to deal with these problems. So everything that I am able to do, including increasing the police's budget. We are now in San Francisco the highest paid in the Bay Area. We weren't at one point. Retention bonuses and other things. So a lot of my ability comes from the budget, the allocation of resources, and in some cases the changes to policies, but not all.
All right, and you're down 500 police officers.
It's it's about 541.
Do police officers want to come work in San Francisco?
That has been a very difficult issue. More recently, yes. Previously, probably not. In this most recent academy class, we expect to have over 30 people, up from the last academy class where we had about 10. So I think the numbers are rising. The number of applications after some of the work we've been doing to help with our relationship with law enforcement has really taken shape and have made us a more attractive destination. So I think we're gradually coming out of that.
I'd like to talk a little bit about we know what people want from you. They want a city that's safe, that's clean, that's vibrant. They don't have one. Maybe it's vibrant, but I think any of us would be hard-pressed to say the city feels safe and clean or is safe and clean right now. A lot of progressives.
Well, let's talk about that.
Let's do.
Let's talk about that. You say safe and clean, and I guess the question is, do you live in San Francisco?
I do not.
And the question I have for San Franciscans mostly, and the various neighborhoods they live in, how do they feel? Because I'm out in the neighborhoods and I'm having conversations. Now, I'm gonna be honest, the Tenderloin is challenging, but I still walk in the Tenderloin because I wanna see what's going on. I wanna have those conversations with the people who live there. The Soma area is very challenging. And when I go to places in other neighborhoods, including the Bayview Hunters Point community, which I was just on 3rd and Newcomb today, which used to be a very notorious block of this community, it's a whole nother place. And so I think San Francisco is, it's a small city, but it's a big city, and it has a lot of different pockets. So I think to imply that the city as a whole is unsafe and not clean is not fair.
Okay, fair enough.
But I do think,
fair enough.
I do think that the problems that exist in the places that they exist are extremely problematic.
Okay.
Extremely problematic.
I'd like to talk about downtown and this, this notion that you have certainly seen. I mean, every day you hear about a big company or a hotel walking away. Right? Westfield Mall was the latest. The narrative is more companies flee, people leave the city, fewer people go downtown. That puts more pressure on the remaining businesses. And is this how you see the doom loop? And is San Francisco in one?
I'm glad you asked that
on.
question. How many of you have been in Nordstrom's, the store Nordstrom's at the Westfield Shopping Center in the last 6 months? Okay, a few people.
I'm going to say like maybe under 10%. So for folks not in San Francisco, the Westfield Mall
and the reason
is closing.
And the reason why I asked, how many of you shop at stores anymore? How many go into malls and stores?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So it's a few people.
About a quarter.
And before the pandemic, how people shop has changed and continues to change and will continue to change. And I think that we can't completely rely on retail and downtown and restricting what happens downtown anymore. What we have done in some legislative changes that I've made is open the door to do more than just retail, because San Francisco has never had to work hard for tourists, for visitors, for people who want to shop here. So there have been a lot of limits placed on what people can do in certain pockets of the city. And policies that I've implemented have changed that. So now you can convert some office to housing a lot easier. You can convert certain spaces like a Westfield Mall could become, you know, something completely different than what it currently is. It could be a place where we can even tear down the whole building and build a whole new soccer stadium. We can create lab space or look at it as, you know, a new company in some other capacity. I mean, I know Brian Chesky is coming up here from Airbnb. He took the old design center where a lot of jewelry was sold. It was a whole nother use and created his whole headquarters at the Showplace Square. So I think we have to start reimagining what downtown can be rather than, you know, what people are saying, oh, this store is going away, that store is going away, this is no longer. Well, no one's talking about the fact that luxury brands are expanding. Yves Saint Laurent and Chanel and all these companies are expanding. So let's look at what's possible rather than dwelling on the stories of another store that there are a lot of people who may not even shop in those places.
Okay, so reimagining. Brian Chesky is next on this stage.
Yeah.
What do you want from the leader of Airbnb, from Mark Benioff, whose giant Salesforce tower is very empty? What do you want from these people whose tremendous wealth was generated in this city? What do you want to see?
So part of what I want to see are people who are committed to San Francisco and doing a couple of things. Look, we know that before the pandemic, people were standing in line waiting. San Francisco has a cap on the amount of square footage that can be allocated for office space. People were waiting in line for it, and now it's changed and it's shifted. So we need to shift.
Yeah, 30% vacancy.
And part of what I want people to do is start being even more creative than they have and thinking about the possibility to utilize space in all parts of San Francisco differently. That's number one. Would I like for everyone to come back to the office 5 days a week? Of course I would. But is that going to happen? Probably not. So let's make some adjustments to do everything we can to reimagine what parts of San Francisco can be and how we can recommit ourselves to, you know, making sure that not only our companies grow and thrive in this city, but how do we get other companies interested to be a part of San Francisco? How do we make it more vibrant? It's not just about the companies and the businesses, it's also about the universities and the institutions. The reason why people want to be here is because of the talent. So places like UC Berkeley, Stanford, UCSF, it's how do we invest in our educational institutions and make sure that they are also a part of what is happening to change the world from here with all of these new and latest technologies. What I want from them is to continue to invest in San Francisco and also to collaborate. We have an Office of Innovation where, and in fact, we received a grant from Bloomberg where it's a collaboration between using all this new technology and everything that you all are doing to make it a part of what we do in San Francisco. I mean, this is like...
Could you be specific? Like, what would you like the people in this room to do? If they want to commit to San Francisco, obviously we have people who believe deeply in this city, and I can tell from the reaction. What do you want these people... So, how do you want people to engage and give back?
So, if people have great ideas, for example, we create apps for everything. Creating apps for something that's going to help us track something. I mean, we're doing the work right now to try and figure out where the needs are, to understand how we can be more efficient. Like, for example, our shelter system. You know, we are working on a way to deal with accountability for the dollars we spend, but also how we use even something as simple as an app to identify a specific location of where we can place people. Just like you can go on some hotel app and find a hotel room, we want to be able to do that to try and get people off the streets into shelter in a more efficient way.
Audience, Mayor, we're almost out of time.
Oh, I see that.
Yeah. So there are a lot of upset people in this city, and you have effectively directed the anger in the system to the previous, the recall of the previous DA, who you mentioned, to members of the San Francisco School Board. People are now upset with you. So a recent poll found that 22% of voters said you deserve to be reelected if the election were today. How do you want people to evaluate your tenure when they decide whether to reelect you next year?
Well, for me, to be clear, I'm not doing this job in fear of losing it. I'm doing the best I can because I've been here all my life and I know that we have problems. And I know we have problems, and I'm willing to put it all on the line and do whatever it takes and take the chances in order to get things done in this city and to turn things around. And at the end of the day, I'm going to keep working my butt off to take care of the city and to make transformative change. And the voters have the right to decide who they want to choose to be their mayor, whether it's me or anyone else. Because no matter if I'm mayor or if I'm a citizen working in any other industry, I'm still going to be here, and I'm still going to be working hard for this city. And my hope is that it's not just about the leaders or the people in charge. It's also about the relationships and the partnerships. And don't just make money from San Francisco, be a part of the solution and give back to San Francisco in some sort of way. And I want to also end by saying this. The new CEO for Deloitte, who talked about the city's model, is, you see it on our city seal. It's iron, gold in peace, iron in war. And every time there's gold and there's money to be made in San Francisco, here comes the rush. Here comes everyone making their money. But then during the difficult and war times, people are, rushing off and leaving and talking mess and running off someplace else to spend their money. And what I'm saying to people is make your money here, but also be a part of the fabric of what makes San Francisco great. Invest in San Francisco. Be involved in San Francisco, because this is not just my city, this is your city too. And together, I know we can do great things.
Mayor London Breed, thank you.